Tengo un libro cuyo nombre les puede sonar familiar, Banqueros e Imperio, pero no es sobre Argentina. El subtítulo es De cómo Wall Street colonizó el Caribe. El autor es Peter James Hudson. Peter Hudson es canadiense, no norteamericano. Nació en 1971, es escritor, historiador, profesor. Es editor de, traducido sería, la revista de la Agenda Negra, que es un suplemento de educación política. Y actualmente da clases en el Departamento de Geografía de la Universidad de la Columbia Británica en Vancouver. Va a estar con nosotros, y ahora que para una entrevista sobre el libro y sobre algunas otras cosas que les van a resultar muy, muy actuales. Peter, what was exactly, in your investigation, dollar diplomacy in practice? What was it?
I think the way to approach the question of dollar diplomacy is to talk about it, first of all, in theory and not in practice. In theory, dollar diplomacy was a form of imperial financial governance developed by the U.S. State Department in the early 20th century, by which, in theory, the State Department would substitute dollars or substitute gunboats for dollars. What that means is that to control, especially the islands and colonies of the Caribbean and Central America, they would control central banks, refinance debt, appoint private financial advisors to organize customs and taxations and other things. And the idea being that if you organized on an efficient and rational basis the finances of these troubled countries, it would enable political control and enable political stability in the Caribbean and Central American region. And this is extremely important for the United States because the idea was that they wanted to control the region in order to protect, especially the canal zone. The Panama Canal had opened in 1914 and became a kind of crucial commercial and strategic node for U.S. commerce between the Atlantic and the Pacific. So that's in theory. In practice, dollar diplomacy included all of the things that I've mentioned above, but it returned to...
It included gunboats.
But it also included gunboats,
obviously.
Exactly. And so you saw during the period of dollar diplomacy, where it was supposed to be this kind of progressive era, rational mode of governance, some of the most brutal forms of U.S. military occupation in places like Haiti, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, and Cuba. So on one level, it's this register where you're using finance for governance. On another level, in practice, the gunboats were still there.
Mm-hmm. And was the problem of backyard or not?
Well, the discourse of the backyard developed later than the policy of dollar diplomacy. But I think we can see it as an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, right? And see it that the United States, the Monroe Doctrine, obviously dating to 1823, which was an attempt by the United States to assert control over the American hemisphere and to suggest that a kind of policy.
They call it Western Hemisphere.
Exactly, mm-hmm. Exactly, and so in that sense, the idea of dollar diplomacy was based on the idea that the Caribbean was a special region. Central America was a special region.
Geopolitically,
but also commercially for the United States.
Mm-hmm. And why?
Why?
Why? Yes.
I think a couple of reasons. First of all, American corporations were moving into the region at an extreme pace. They wanted to have monopoly control of the commodities coming out of the region, but also the sale of manufactured goods in the region. And I would also argue that they wanted control over labor markets. They were interested in not only displacing Britain and France, but also Germany, which was quite prominent here in Argentina, in Cuba and other places with banking and manufacturing up until the First World War. And so I think there is the demands for commercial supremacy in the Americas, geopolitical supremacy in the Americas. And part of it, and this becomes the kind of intangible part of the theory, is part of it is because of an ideology of American exceptionalism and the belief that they have a right to the territory, that there's manifest destiny, a divine right, a God-given right to control all of the Americas.
Mm-hmm. Which was the role of the banks in those times?
So the banks were important for a number of reasons. First of all, they took the lead in financing the import-export trade of the Americas, especially for instance of sugar in Cuba. The banks also wanted to displace both the French, the British, and the German banks that were already had embedded themselves in the region since the 19th century, if not before. And so they were interested in refinancing the debts that had been previously financed through Europe up until the First World War. They were interested in taking over monopoly control of wharves, docks, railroads, sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, other plantations, and they were interested in controlling the financial systems, taxation, customs revenue. And so you look at, for instance, at a country like Haiti, which we all talk about now as the poorest country in the hemisphere. In 1910, city bankers said, Haiti will be a lucrative piece of business for us. They saw that in sugar, in railroads, in sisal, in other commodities, as well as in the control of customs and taxation, would be a huge benefit to them. So in some ways, the banks were really crucial in being the kind of intermediaries between finance and the state in many of these regions.
And the debt became a political instrument.
Absolutely. And I think this is a really important sense to
How did it work?
Well, I think
which was the mechanism?
Yeah. So what they were able to do in places like Cuba or in places like Haiti, by refinancing the debt, you're taking over a debt that's been funded by another country or another entity, and then you're stretching.
And you are conditional politics also.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. So you're stretching the amortization of it, you're setting an interest rate for it, but then you're making certain demands on those countries by lending them the money. So you can say, well, okay, if we're going to lend you $10 million, part of that money needs to go, first of all, to paying back our debt, secondly, to buying American goods, thirdly, to paying U.S. administrative staff. And then on top of that, we're going to take a fee. So the first part of that gets to the kind of politics of it, because you can then say, well, if I wanted to use the money that I borrowed from Citibank to finance schools, to build roads, and Citibank saying, well, no, you can't. We need you to pay us before you pay your teachers. This becomes a political issue. And
it sounds for us very familiar.
Yeah, you've heard this story before.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. And I think people...
And nowadays also.
And I think all over Latin America, all over the Caribbean, all over Africa, it's the same story, where you see that the what we now call structural adjustment programs or adjustment conditionalities were happening in the 1920s. And importantly, I think we have to say that you look at the case of Cuba, for instance. Machado was the banker's candidate. He was supported by the banks through his...
Machado was in the 30s.
He was
in the 30s.
In the 30s, exactly. From the mid-19... I think he was reelected in 1925 and then deposed in the early 1930s. Mm-hmm. But he was the favorite candidate of J.P. Morgan. He was a favorite candidate of the Citibank, to the point where one of the officers of J.P. Morgan said something to the effect of, "We will do anything in our power to make sure he is reelected."
Which was exactly the mechanism that was the basement of the relation between banks, the Department of State, the Pentagon or Department of War, gunboats, and geopolitics.
I think the easiest way to talk about this is, again, for me, in the case of Haiti, where you had vice presidents of the Citibank who were in Haiti. In the first instance, they had previously worked in or with or by officials in what was then the Department of War. So they were very familiar with Washington on a first name basis with the secretaries of war, with presidents. And so there's that social familiarity. And that social familiarity leads to their ability to make demands of the state. In the case of Haiti, the bankers, the officials of the Citibank called or telegrammed Washington and said, we need a gunboat to come and take away Haiti's entire gold reserve. And so one day in 1914, a boat that was already anchored off Haiti landed in Port-au-Prince. Marines got off the ship.
Like employees or partnership?
Who, the Marines?
Yes.
It seems like they're employed at this point.
Okay.
But I mean, I think you would call it a partnership. And they marched the gold reserve onto a gunboat and took it back to vaults in D.C. or in New York City.
So Peter, you would consider Haiti as a lab?
I would say Haiti's a lab. I'd say Haiti was a lab in the 1910s and 1920s for both practices of finance and also practices of militarism. It was one of the first places that the U.S. carried out aerial bombing campaigns on local populations. And I think we can look at Haiti even in its more recent history. Right now, the Haitian airport has gone under private control of a mercenary organization based in the United States. And so I would say it's a laboratory. I would say, and I want to be a little bit cautious with that word though, because when we say a laboratory, we think that it's only experimentation. But there was success in that experimentation. There was extraction in that experimentation. And they would always revise and learn from their mistakes and their successes and then move that to other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. So there was a lab and there was an actual experiment.
Right. Absolutely. And the experiment was on the Haitian people or on the Cuban people or perhaps now on the Argentinian people when we think about it.
Or perhaps about the people all over the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that we're what I saw in my research, that there was an eagerness and a willingness to use other people's lives to find out new ways of extraction, new ways of accumulation, and also new ways of repression.
Now, as you may know, Peter Thiel is in Argentina and is living in Argentina. He bought a house near from here where we are recording this interview, 2 kilometers from here. Do you see any other... Can you compare Peter Thiel or Palantir and those banks that take over Haiti and all the Central and Caribbean?
I think what I see with Peter Thiel, with Palantir, is on one level an intensification of the practices of monopoly capitalism, of surveillance, of control, of accumulation, that have always been a part of the history of capitalism and were intensified during the 1920s and 1930s, but now it seemed to have come back with a kind of vengeance. What I also see is Peter Thiel and Palantir and Alex Karp of Palantir returning to the kind of visions of manifest destiny, the visions of a kind of civilizing mission of the United States and with the white
which
race.
Kind of civilization? Because they want to change also the American civilization,
right? Well, I think
or not.
They do. Well, I mean, I think if currently American civilization can be seen as a somewhat polyglot, multicultural democratic experiment,
Exactly.
They want to get rid of that. They want to return to rule by the elites. They want to return by rule by exceptional white men, and they want to see that the masses of all colors repressed. And I think this is a kind of intensification of earlier ideas. The one thing I would say about a person like Peter Thiel and Alex Karp versus a J.P. Morgan or a Carnegie, as terrible as some of the actions of Carnegie or Morgan were, they had some basic sense of the public good. And J.P. Morgan funded libraries, Carnegie funded libraries. There's a sense of using your wealth. You know, they thought they were better than everybody else, but they would use their wealth to provide spaces for the poor, even if it was in the most paternal way. That idea of
an illustrated elite
is completely erased. And now it's a sense of us versus them, and that the masses of people in the United States, around the world, are threats to the power of this group.
Peter, why did you choose this subject, being a Canadian?
It's a great question. I think as a Canadian, I was always interested in the power of the United States. As a Canadian, the United States politically, economically, culturally always looms as a shadow over Canadian culture, Canadian politics. There was a kind of great tradition of Canadian political economy that was trying to understand how can Canada become a sovereign state economically by delinking both from England and from the United States. And I was interested in the Caribbean. I was interested in the histories of Caribbean underdevelopment. And what I found was there was a lot of work, obviously, on the histories of England in the Caribbean, but there wasn't the kind of books I was looking for on the United States, looking at the Caribbean in its entirety. There's books on the U.S. and Cuba, U.S. and Panama, but to understand that Wall Street saw the Caribbean as a whole. They had a vision for it as a whole, and I thought it was important to try to recount that story. And to say that, it wasn't just important for me as a Canadian, but to understand as someone who has roots in the Caribbean and as a person of African descent, to understand the role of finance.
Which part of Africa?
Which part of Africa?
Yeah.
Well,
you know that?
I wish I did. You
don't know that?
No. I mean, my father was born in Jamaica, but I mean, came to his ancestors came to the Caribbean as an enslaved person, and so much of that history is erased or unknown. But I think to think about there's an importance, I think, to understanding the history of Black people, not merely as a study of identity and culture, but as a study as one major and important part of the history of capitalism since the era of slavery.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
So Peter Hudson here in ¿Y ahora qué? And now what?